So you want to buy an E90 generation BMW. You could buy a Honda Accord, only ever have to change the oil, do the brakes, hardly any maintenance, spend hardly anything on the car at all, and it'll last 300,000 miles, no problem. But that's not what you want. You want something that looks a little better, something that's a little more special, has a little more road presence, something that drives better, something that's enjoyable to own. So now you've arrived at a BMW 3 Series. Well, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know in order to have a successful ownership experience of this car, in order to have the right knowledge going in so you purchase the right one in the first place, and so you enjoy your ownership experience. Now, everything that we talk about today is going to be specific to this generation of BMW. We're not going to cover some of the more basic tips and suggestions of things that you should do when you're going out and purchasing a used car. There's a ton of other resources out there on that topic, and I encourage you to go out there and look into that. Everything that we're going to talk about today is going to be preparing you for some of the details of this specific platform. Now, also along with that topic, I'm going to be using a write-up that can be found on the forums. I'll link it below, that details a lot of this information that I'll be talking about, as well as some of my own personal experience from having owned this car and some of the things that I've learned along the way. So first, we're going to cover the different models that are available from this generation BMW, this generation 3 Series. The first one that you have is the E90. So that's the sedan. That's probably the most common one that you'll see around, 4-door sedan. The second one is the E91. That's the chassis code for the wagon version of this car. A little bit more rare, you don't see them as often, but they did make a wagon for this generation BMW. Next one is the E92. So that's what I have. That is the 2-door coupe. It's another very popular one. You probably do see a good amount of the coupes out on the road. And then the last is the E93. So that is the convertible version. Still a coupe, but it's a convertible. They're all hardtop convertibles, and they fold down nicely into the trunk. So once you've narrowed down the specific model that you're going to be looking at, you're also going to be looking at the year. So this generation was produced between 2007 and 2011 for the sedans, and actually 2000 and all the way through 2013 for the coupe. Now with that, BMW does what they call a LCI model, or a life cycle impulse, that they do for every single generation of their cars. Midway through the life cycle of that generation, they'll release the LCI, which is going to be slightly updated. So the later ones, I believe for the sedans, it switched over in 2009. For the coupes, 2010. Anything with those build dates and later are going to be the LCI models. So that means that the newer LCI models are going to have updated lights. They're going to have updated body panels. They're going to have slightly different styling on the hood, the trunk, the side skirts. And some of that can also change depending on whether you have an M Sport model, a couple different packages. But generally the LCI models, the newer part of this generation, they're going to have a more updated, more modern look. The LCI models are also going to be typically a little bit more expensive, partially because they're newer cars, they're not as old, and also because the updated look is more desirable. They've aged a bit better, so people will pay a bit more for them because they look like a newer car. The next thing to consider is if you're going to get an xDrive car. xDrive is BMW's terminology for an all-wheel drive car. My recommendation is, unless you really, really need it, stick with the rear-wheel drive cars. They're lighter, they have better suspension, they handle better. I'm going to make a whole separate video talking about the differences between the all-wheel drive cars and the rear-wheel drive cars. I actually own an all-wheel drive and xDrive car myself, but generally my recommendation is, unless you really, really need that all-wheel drive, get some snow tires, stick with the rear-wheel drive. It's typically a better driving experience, and I think most people would enjoy it a bit better. Then options. When you're looking at the cars, you're going to see they come with a lot of different options. I'm not going to dive too much into that right now. Again, there's a lot of other information out about that. If you actually look at the first video I ever made, it's an options overview of the options that came on my car, which is a pretty highly spec'd car, so it does have most of the options most people would want. I go through my window sticker. If you're interested in that, go check out that video. I'll link it down below. Do your research ahead of time on the options. There's probably going to be some that you definitely want and some that you can give or take and not have to be too picky about. The more flexible you are, obviously the easier it is going to be to find a car that fits the bill for you. So do the research into the options ahead of time, and check out that video if you think it'd be helpful. Next, we're going to cover the different engine options that you can get in this car. Again, I'm going to simplify it a little bit. There are a couple different variations of this, but for the most part, you're going to run into the N52 engine, which is found in the 328, the N54, which is found in most of the 335s from this generation. The N55 is found in the later 335i's, so it would be the 2011 335i's for the sedans and the 2011 through 2013 335i's for the coupe. BMW does also make a diesel option for these cars. I'm not going to dive too much into that. You don't see a whole lot of those cars, and I also don't have a ton of experience with those cars. And then also, of course, BMW does have the V8 that's found in the M3 version of this Generation 3 series. Also, again, not going to dive too much into that. That's kind of in its own category. Now we're going to talk about the reliability of these cars and some of the common problems that come up. This is very important to know ahead of time. These cars are not the cheapest to keep on the road. Parts are expensive. When things break, labor is expensive. If you can do the work yourself, highly recommend that. They're not the hardest cars in the world to work on, and you'll save a whole lot of money because things are going to go wrong with them. At this point, you're looking at 10, 15-year-old BMWs, German cars. They have a lot of engineering into them. They're pretty complex, so things are going to go wrong. Thankfully, a lot of these issues are very well known. There's a lot of people who own these cars and work on these cars, so a lot of those issues are well publicized, and there's a lot of information out there about them, which is really great. But you do need to be prepared for the cost and the expense of keeping this car on the road before you buy it, because it's something that can be significant at times, and you should have money set aside for it. So first of all, things that affect pretty much every model of the E90 generation BMW, regardless of what engine you have. Number one would be your water pump. BMW put an electronic water pump in these cars, meaning that it's not belt driven. It's controlled by an electronic module that's within the pump directly from the car's ECU, and there's a lot of benefits to that. It's really great, but they are known to fail, and it's not an actual failure of the pump, but it's a failure of those electronics. There is no way to really fix that. You need to do a whole pump replacement. They are known to fail as early as every 60,000 miles. So depending on what mileage of the car that you're looking at, that's something that you want to consider, something that you want to see if it's been replaced before. When those go bad, it can be it's usually $1,000+ to have somebody else do it. You can do it yourself for probably in the range of $400 for just the part itself. Next up is the oil leaks. BMWs are notorious for oil leaks. It seems like BMW doesn't know how to make a gasket that's not going to completely degrade and start dumping oil all over the place. But they are very important on this car to address for a number of reasons. So first of all, your oil filter housing gasket. BMWs generally have the oil filter sitting on top of the engine, which is really great and convenient for oil changes, but that housing, that metal housing that holds that oil filter, is bolted to the block, the side of the block, and there's a gasket in between there that is known to leak very frequently, usually before 80,000 miles. My car, it started leaking at 54,000 miles, and I had to address it, replace it. That's a big one. You want to take care of that right away, because what can happen is if that continues to leak and the leak gets bad enough, you're going to have oil start dripping on your belt, the serpentine belt on the front of the engine. And if enough oil gets on there, eventually that belt is going to slip off the pulley. And on these cars, when that happens, the belt ends up getting sucked into the front main seal of the engine, destroying that main seal, getting rubber belt shards inside your engine, and it can actually destroy your engine if enough of that belt gets sucked in there. And at a minimum, it's going to be a very expensive fix to get that front main seal replaced. Another common oil leak is the valve cover gasket. That's typically around the same mileage, 80,000 miles. It's bound to have happened at that point, but it can happen either before or, if you're lucky, a little bit after that. But again, that needs to be addressed, because what's going to start happening is, with the way that the engine is angled and where the valve cover gasket starts leaking from, you're going to have oil start dripping onto your hot exhaust. On the turbo cars, it starts dripping onto the downpipes, and you're going to have a burning oil smell. You could have smoke. It's something that you don't want to leave. You need to address it to stop that oil burning and make sure that you're not losing oil in that area. The last one is the oil pan gasket. That one is also bound to leak at some point. It'll start sweating, and then it'll eventually develop into a full leak that will need to be addressed. That is an expensive one. That is a big job to do because you generally need to drop the whole front subframe of the car in order to get in there and replace that gasket. It is a pain to do, especially if you have an all-wheel drive car, an X-Drive car. It is quite a bit of work. It is quite expensive if you have somebody do that. So if you're looking at one of these cars, get under there, see what that oil pan gasket's doing, see if it's been replaced. If it hasn't and it's leaking bad enough, it's going to be pretty costly to have it done. All right, so now we're going to start diving into a little bit of more engine specific maintenance items that you're going to need to address. So for the N54, which is the twin turbo 6-cylinder that's found in most of the 335i's, the 335i's made from 07 through 010, those engines have a number of problems. They're great engines. You can make a ton of power with them. If you're looking at this video, you're probably looking at that engine and thinking about the ways that you can modify it to make more power, but there is quite a bit that needs to go along with that. So number one is the big one. We'll talk about the turbos. The turbos are known to have wastegate rattle. Basically, the way you can hear that is if you're sitting in the car, even with it just idling, and you rev it up a little bit, as soon as the RPM start dropping and the engine decelerates, you'll hear a rattling sound. And that means that the wastegates basically on the turbos are worn, they're loose, and they're rattling as the exhaust gases are moving over them. Eventually, they're going to stop sealing properly, and you're going to have boost problems. Really, the only fix for that is new turbos, which is going to be like almost $2,000 for parts alone. At that point, you may as well upgrade your turbos. That is a whole can of worms. That happens at pretty early mileage, pre-100,000 miles for some people, and sometimes people get 200,000 miles out of the stock turbos. You never know. There is, like, read up on it. There is a lot of information out there on it, because it is a very well-known problem. Those turbos do go bad, believe it or not, more frequently than you would like. So if you're looking at N54, that is the big one. Another thing for the N54, the N55 as well, but to a much lesser extent, is carbon buildup. Basically, because those turbo engines are direct injected, that means that the intake valves don't get cleaned and they can have a whole lot of carbon buildup. If you let it get bad enough, you're gonna have idling problems, rough running. The engine's not gonna perform the way it should. So really, as frequently as every 60,000 miles, they suggest a walnut blast to go in there, take the intake manifold off, get in there and clean those valves off, get all that carbon off. It's going to be something that, again, you're going to need to take care of at some point in your ownership. You're going to want to know if it's been done before you've owned the car. Next thing for the N54, fuel injectors. There are 12 different iterations of the fuel injector for the N54 engine. The Index 12s are the best. They are expensive. They're like $1,500 for parts alone. If you don't have the Index 12s, chances are you're going to have faulty or leaking fuel injectors at some point and need to swap them out and change them because your car is going to be misfiring. It's just the reality of the situation. It happens to every N54 until you get the Index 12s in there. Along with that, you're going to be doing spark plugs and ignition coils as well. Ignition coils are known also to cause problems, create a misfire. They need to be replaced more frequently on the N54 than your average car. And if you're tuned on an N54, you're going to have to be doing all of that stuff, spark plugs and coils, much more frequently. Some people even say like every 20,000 miles because of the extra demand of the tune, and the engine's already prone to having problems with those parts. The last thing I'll mention is the high pressure fuel pump on the turbo engines. Generally more of a problem with the N54. Also happens a little bit in the N55s as well, but the high pressure fuel pump will go out and go bad and you won't be able to run the car. You're gonna start off having fuel delivery problems, and then it'll get to a point where you're just not gonna have enough enough fuel pressure to get the car running. Again, it's an expensive fix. There is some recall and warranty information out there for some of the cars, not all of them. You're going to want to make sure that that's been replaced and that's been fixed either before you buy this car, and if it hasn't, you're going to have to plan on doing it at some point during your ownership. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm trying to give like a quick overview of some of the big points. I'll probably, again, make a separate video talking about that in more detail, the maintenance stuff on the turbo engines. You'll notice that I haven't really talked much about the N52 engine, the naturally aspirated version of the 6-cylinder that's found in this generation. It's a great engine. It makes decent power, and it doesn't run into a lot of these reliability problems that I'm talking about that is more complicated, more stuff going wrong on the turbo versions. You will still run into the water pump stuff. You still will run into the same oil leak problems, but that engine is a phenomenal engine. It's great. There's people who have that engine up to 400,000 miles. It's pretty incredible. If you like this platform, like this car, and you don't want to have to invest a lot of time and money into keeping the car running, that is probably the engine that you're going to want. However, the flip side of it is that it does fall a little bit short on the modification side, and you're not going to get much more power out of it than what came from the factory, but it's still a great engine. Next topic is going to be diagnostics and the equipment that you can use to help work on the car, read engine codes and stuff like that. You're going to need a BMW specific scan tool because a generic scan tool is not going to tell you enough information. Generally, the best ways to do that is if you really want to go out, you can download BMW Standard Tools, which is basically the software that they use at the dealerships to diagnose your car. You need a Windows operating computer as well as a K+D CAN cable that is going to connect that computer to the OBD2 port of your car. The next step that you could do is what I do, which is I would highly recommend getting the Bimmer Geeks Pro Tool software. That's going to run off of some sort of Android device, whether it be a cell phone or a tablet, and it's going to use either a similar K+D CAN cable or a Wi-Fi adapter. There's a number of different things out there, but that is basically a simplified version of those BMW tools into an application that you can use. It does diagnostics, coding, live data. It reads each one of the modules of the car. It gives you all the specific BMW codes that are assigned to each one of those modules. Really comprehensive tool, really great. I've loved using it. I'll probably make a few videos talking specifically about that. If you don't go with either one of those options, Carly is also out there. That's all over the internet. They do a lot of advertising, a lot of sponsorships on YouTube. So that's an option. Look into that. And you can get different scanners that are BMW specific. There's a Foxwell scanner out there that's pretty popular that people use. But you're gonna need a BMW scanner because things are going to go wrong with the car, and you want to be able to diagnose it a bit yourself before either going to a shop, if you're bringing it to a shop, or really being able to do the work yourself. So to close things out and summarize my thoughts, these are great cars. There is a reason people are interested in buying them, because they're generally enthusiast focused, they're good driving cars, they look great. And of course they come with the BMW name, which is desirable to people. And at this point, they have depreciated, as most German cars do. They're 10, 15 years old. They're in a lot of cases very affordable, sub $10,000 cars, depending on what you're looking at. But you want to be careful. You probably better off paying a bit more to get a better sorted car. If you can, and you're looking to buy one, go on the forums first, and if you can find a car to purchase in your area on the forums, that's going to likely be your best bet, because it's just more likely that somebody who's an enthusiast, is a forum member, has spent a little bit more time and care taking care of the car, keeping up with maintenance and all of that stuff, which is really important. If you are buying off of Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, something like that, even from a dealership, you need to make sure that you ask for service records and stuff like that. As much of a history that you can get on these cars ahead of time is going to be really beneficial. It's going to be really important to know what's been replaced on these cars. Having an idea of a couple of the things that I talked about, where to look for those things in terms of maintenance items and things that can go wrong. If you do that ahead of time and get that information, do your research, check out the car thoroughly before purchasing it, you're likely going to set yourself up for a much more successful ownership experience. So again, these are great cars. I encourage all car enthusiasts to own one of these cars at some point because they really do check a lot of the boxes, but you need to know what you're getting yourself into ahead of time. You need to prepare financially. You need to prepare for the amount of time that you're going to need to invest in the car to keep it running, keep it operating in the correct condition. That's going to do it for today. I tried to give a quick high-level interview. I'm going to have a ton of other videos coming out going into some of these topics in more detail, getting a little bit more in-depth into it. But hopefully this was helpful if you're going to consider one of these cars and you're looking into one of them. If you're watching this video ahead of purchasing one of these cars, you got a good start. You're thinking along the right lines, doing the research ahead of time. Keep with that. Make sure that you know what you're doing before you go and actually make the purchase. But thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, if you found this was helpful, please like and subscribe. I got more videos coming out on this platform every week, and it's starting to get warm now, so it's getting to a point of the year where we can actually start getting outside and doing stuff with the car instead of just sitting inside of it and talking. All right, guys, that's gonna be it for now. We'll see you next time. Peace.